I am Joshua, 29, and my dad gave my wedding fund to my brother because he deserved a real wedding. Before I tell you about how my fiancé exposed them all and flipped our entire family dynamic upside down, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. The dining room was suffocatingly warm that night, heavy with the scent of roasted garlic and the expensive prime rib my mother only ever prepared for one specific reason. Matthew had news. It was a random Tuesday evening, yet the good china had been carefully arranged. The crystal water glasses were catching the light from the overhead chandelier, and everyone was dressed like we were attending a country club mixer. Everyone, that is, except for me and my fiancée, Chloe. We were sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table. Chloe was wearing her favorite navy turtleneck sweater, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, and a simple pair of jeans. I was in a plain button-down shirt I'd worn to a client meeting earlier that day. Underneath the heavy linen tablecloth, Chloe's hand rested quietly on my knee. Her thumb rubbed a slow, calming circle over the fabric of my slacks. She always knew when my anxiety was spiking, and in this house, my anxiety was a constant, living thing. My dad, Robert, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who measured a person's worth strictly by their job title, the car they drove, and the zip code they lived in. He cleared his throat, a sharp, authoritative sound. He set his wine glass down on a cork coaster with a heavy, deliberate clink that immediately commanded the room's absolute attention. He looked to his right, where my older brother, Matthew, sat next to his fiancée, Isabella. Isabella was practically vibrating with excitement, her manicured fingers tightly gripping her crystal glass. Finally, my father's eyes landed on me. There was no hesitation in his voice. There was no softening of the blow, no flicker of paternal guilt. Just cold, hard entitlement. "Joshua," my dad said, leaning forward and resting his forearms on the table, "your mother and I have been going over the finances. With Matthew's wedding coming up in 6 months, and considering the sheer scale of the event Isabella's family is expecting us to host, we've had to make a very practical decision." He paused, letting the silence stretch. I felt my chest tighten. "We gave your wedding fund to your brother. He deserves a royal wedding. You and Chloe can always go to the courthouse. It fits your lifestyle better anyway." He said it like he was proud. He said it like he was bestowing a Congressional Medal of Honor upon his firstborn son. The room completely froze. My mother, sitting across from Matthew, simply nodded her approval, taking a delicate, unbothered sip of her Cabernet. Matthew smiled. It wasn't a grateful smile. It was a wide, arrogant smirk that pushed up the corners of his eyes. The look of a man who had just won a game he didn't even have to play. Isabella let out a high-pitched squeal, reached over, and clapped her hands together. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't flip my plate or storm out of the house. The heartbreaking truth is, a deep, exhausted part of me had always known this exact moment was coming. I felt a familiar, hollow ache spreading rapidly through my chest. The exact same ache I'd carried around in this house since I was 7 years old. My jaw clamped shut so tight my teeth ground together. I turned my head slowly and just looked at Chloe. She didn't look at my dad. She didn't look at my mother. Chloe just kept her dark, piercing eyes locked dead on Matthew. The temperature in the dining room seemed to plummet 10 degrees in a matter of seconds as she calmly, deliberately pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly, violently against the pristine hardwood floor. She stood up. The entire table went dead silent. Isabella stopped squealing. My mother lowered her wine glass. My dad frowned, clearly offended by the interruption. Chloe reached into the back pocket of her jeans, pulled out her phone, unlocked the screen with a quick swipe, and placed it face up on the table, right next to my father's untouched plate of prime rib. She kept her posture perfectly straight and her voice entirely level. It was completely devoid of the panic, anger, or humiliation they were desperately hoping to extract from her. "Should I tell them what I do for a living?" Chloe asked. Matthew's smirk vanished. The smugness drained out of his face so fast it looked like the air had been violently sucked out of his lungs. He stared at the phone screen, his eyes widening in pure shock. But to understand why Chloe's simple question landed like a devastating bomb on that mahogany table, you have to understand exactly how we got to this point. The betrayal didn't start with a stolen bank transfer. It started decades ago. I grew up in a house where love was treated as a highly exclusive currency, and I was born entirely broke. My parents worshipped at the altar of achievement and public appearances. Our living room walls were practically a museum dedicated to Matthew. Every single frame, every polished shelf held a milestone of his existence. There were his high school debate trophies, gleaming under the recessed lighting. There were the framed certificates from his college fund that my dad loved to brag about to the neighbors at every summer barbecue. There was the heavy glass plaque commemorating his first promotion at the corporate marketing firm he worked for. My memories, on the other hand, lived entirely in the shadows. I was the second son, the quiet one, the one who liked to sit in the dirt and draw blueprints or build intricate architectural models instead of playing varsity football or running for class president. I built a very solid, respectable career as a freelance architect and designer. I paid my own bills, I never asked them for a dime, and I lived a peaceful, self-sufficient life. But in my parents' eyes, freelance was just a polite, embarrassing word for unemployed. I remember coming home one specific afternoon when I was 16 years old. I had just won a prestigious state-level architectural design contest for high school students. It was a huge deal. I brought the wooden plaque home, my hands literally shaking with excitement. I walked through the front door and straight into the kitchen, ready to finally show my dad that I was good at something too. He was standing by the island on his phone, loudly congratulating Matthew on making the dean's list at his university. I stood there, holding my plaque, for 10 excruciating minutes. When my dad finally hung up the phone, he turned around and noticed me standing there. He looked down at my plaque, gave it a quick, dismissive tap with his index finger, and said, "That's nice, Josh. Make sure you take out the trash before dinner. The cans need to be on the curb tonight." I didn't argue. I didn't show him the judge's comments on the back of the plaque. I just turned around, walked to my bedroom, and slid that wooden plaque far under my bed, where it sat collecting dust for years. That single moment became the defining metaphor for my entire life in that house. Keep your head down. Do not expect applause. Do not ask for recognition. Survive the quiet. I learned exactly how to be invisible, how to move through the hallways without making a sound, because being seen only ever reminded my parents that I wasn't Matthew. I wasn't the golden child. I was just the spare part. The toxic family dynamic wasn't just enforced by my parents. It was eagerly supported by the rest of the extended family. My Uncle Wyatt, my dad's younger brother, was arguably the worst offender. Wyatt was the kind of guy who constantly preached loudly about family loyalty and sticking together, while actively stirring the pot behind everyone's backs. Wyatt had gone through a notoriously nasty divorce and a brutal custody battle a few years back. It drained his bank accounts and left him bitter. But somehow, going through that mess made him truly believe he was the supreme, unquestionable authority on family unity and sacrifice. Whenever we had family gatherings, Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July, and I tried to subtly stand up for myself or set a basic boundary, Wyatt would pull me aside. He'd grip my shoulder a little too hard, lean in close so I could smell the cheap beer on his breath, and say, "Josh, you gotta let your brother have his moment. You know how your parents are. They expect big things from him. Just yield. It's easier for everyone if you just yield and don't make a scene." I yielded my entire life. I yielded the master bedroom when we moved houses. I yielded my parents' attention on my own birthdays if Matthew had a soccer game. I yielded my fundamental right to be treated as an equal human being. I became an absolute master at reading the room. I could walk into the kitchen, sense my father's mood by the way he held his coffee mug, and immediately fold myself into the smallest possible space so I wouldn't disrupt their perfect, curated family portrait. I swallowed my pride so many times I forgot what it tasted like. But I wasn't completely alone. The only person who actually saw me, the only person who looked at me and didn't see a disappointment, was the woman who lived in the converted in-law suite on the first floor of our house. My Grandma Rose. Grandma Rose's room was a sanctuary. It always smelled wonderfully of old paperbacks, dried lavender, and vanilla. While my parents were out at expensive restaurants celebrating Matthew's latest victory, I would be sitting on the faded braided rug at the foot of her worn-out armchair. She never interrogated me. She never asked me why I wasn't more outgoing, or why I didn't wear polo shirts like my brother. She would just quietly stand up, walk to her small kitchenette, and slide a plate of warm, homemade chocolate chip cookies toward me. She'd sit back down, adjust her reading glasses, and say, "Eat, Joshua. The world out there is bitter enough. We have to make our own sweetness." She was my anchor to sanity. She validated my existence. When I finally graduated from college, my parents didn't make it to the ceremony. They claimed Matthew had an incredibly important networking golf tournament that they simply had to attend to support his career. I sat in the crowded bleachers in my cap and gown, looking up at the sea of cheering families, staring at the empty seats where my parents should have been. My chest felt so tight I could barely breathe. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, Grandma Rose. She had secretly hired a car service, taken a 2-hour ride all by herself, leaning heavily on her wooden cane, just to be there. She was standing near the bottom of the bleachers, wearing a bright blue coat, holding a single yellow rose in her trembling hand. When I walked across that stage, she was the only one clapping for me. She gave my life the softness and the grace that it desperately needed to survive the sandpaper reality of my parents. And then, a few years later, I met Chloe. We met purely by accident at a crowded downtown coffee shop where I was aggressively sketching some difficult blueprints for a client. She was rushing to a meeting, bumped into my small table, spilled half her iced tea across my notebook, and was so mortified she immediately offered to buy me lunch to make up for the damage. I agreed, mostly because she looked incredibly stressed and I wanted to calm her down. We clicked instantly. It was the easiest conversation I had ever had in my life. Chloe was quiet, fiercely intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by flashy things. She didn't care about name brands or social climbing. When I finally gathered the courage to bring her home to meet my family for the first time, she wore a simple, oversized gray sweater and well-worn denim jeans. She looked beautiful to me, but my dad took one look at her outfit, glanced at her scuffed leather boots, and visibly mentally filed her in the unimportant and unimpressive category. At the dinner table that night, he relentlessly interrogated her. He didn't ask about her hobbies or her family. He went straight for the jugular. "So, Chloe," he said, aggressively cutting his steak, "what exactly is your salary trajectory in your line of work? Because Joshua's freelance income is highly unstable. You look very comfortable." He said the word comfortable like it was a contagious disease. Chloe didn't flinch. She just smiled warmly, took a slow sip of her ice water and said, "I make enough to live a life I truly enjoy, Mr. Evans. And I love Joshua. That's all that matters to me." My dad scoffed loudly, rolled his eyes, and immediately turned the conversation back to Matthew's recent car purchase. He completely ignored Chloe for the rest of the evening. But after dinner, while my parents were watching TV, Grandma Rose pulled Chloe aside into her suite. They talked by the garden window for nearly an hour. I paced the hallway, worried my family had scared her off. When Chloe finally came out to get her coat, Grandma Rose followed her. Grandma reached out, squeezed my hand tightly, and whispered in my ear, "She has an iron spine, Joshua," Grandma said, her eyes gleaming with approval. "She's steadier than she looks. Do not let this family ruin this for you. Keep her." Fast forward a couple of years. When Matthew and Isabella officially announced their engagement, our house turned into a toxic, high-stress military command center. Isabella didn't just want a wedding. She wanted a coronation. She wanted an event that looked like it belonged on the cover of a luxury bridal magazine. And my parents were completely, obsessively consumed by it. Every single conversation, every family meal, every weekend was hijacked by endless venue tours, aggressive debates over floral arrangements, and vicious arguments over guest lists. Chloe and I had actually gotten engaged a few months prior to Matthew. We were quietly planning a small, intimate ceremony at a local botanical garden. Nothing crazy, just close friends and good food. But suddenly, our plans were treated as a massive, selfish inconvenience. If Chloe and I had a cake tasting scheduled on a Saturday, my mother would call on Friday night, demanding we cancel it to help Isabella assemble 300 handmade invitations. We were repeatedly asked to move our dates, cancel our vendor appointments, and essentially put our entire lives on indefinite hold so my parents could funnel all their energy, and eventually all their money, into Matthew. I swallowed the frustration. I bit my tongue so hard it bled. I told myself and I told Chloe that it was just a few months of madness and then it would be over. We just had to survive the wedding season. But I was so incredibly wrong. The real gut punch, the absolute betrayal that finally broke me, came exactly 1 week before that fateful dinner where my dad made his grand announcement. I was at my parents' house in my dad's home office. He had called me over to fix his printer network because it kept jamming, and he refused to pay tech support. I fixed the issue and needed a piece of scratch paper to run a test print. I opened the top drawer of his heavy oak desk. Right on top of a stack of files was a thick leather ledger labeled Wedding Accounts and Estate. I shouldn't have looked. I know I shouldn't have, but the numbers caught my eye. There was a column clearly labeled for my wedding fund, and a much larger column for Matthew's. My dad had always told me he had a small savings account set aside for my wedding, a rare gesture of fairness that I had deeply appreciated. But what made the blood freeze in my veins was a specific, detailed transfer history attached to my column. When I was 22, right out of college, my dad had made a terrible, reckless investment in a commercial real estate flip. He almost lost our family home. I was terrified for my mother and grandma, so I took on 3 grueling freelance jobs. I slept maybe 4 hours a night for a year and a half. I bled myself dry and handed over 40% of my total life savings to my dad to help bail the family out of bankruptcy. He promised me, with tears in his eyes back then, that the money was a loan, and he would put it into a special fund for my future when he got back on his feet. Looking at the ledger, I finally realized the devastating truth. The wedding fund he was so generously holding for me wasn't his money. It wasn't a gift. Nearly half of it was the exact cash I had broken my back to earn years ago to save his skin. And the ledger showed a massive, recent bank transfer dated just 2 days ago. He had completely zeroed out my account. He moved every single cent, my sweat, my sleepless nights, my sacrifice, directly into Matthew's wedding budget to pay for Isabella's imported orchids. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk. My jaw locked so tight my teeth genuinely ached. He didn't just play favorites. He literally stole from me to fund his golden child's ego trip. I stumbled out of the office, feeling physically sick, and walked straight out the back door into the yard. Grandma Rose was sitting on her weathered wooden bench, carefully pruning her beloved hydrangeas. The sky was overcast, the air heavy and humid. She took one look at my pale face, immediately set her pruning shears down, and wiped the dirt from her hands. I didn't even have to say the words. I just collapsed onto the bench next to her. "They take because you let them, Joshua," she said softly, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the garden. I buried my face in my hands, rubbing my eyes until I saw stars. I just wanted peace, Grandma. I just wanted them to be happy. I thought if I just didn't cause trouble, eventually they would respect me. She reached out and placed a frail, dirt-stained hand firmly on my knee. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Joshua, listen to me," she said, her tone sharp and serious. "Sometimes the loudest rooms have the least truth in them. They are making a lot of noise over Matthew right now. They are throwing money and throwing parties. But noise isn't love. Noise is just desperation. And peace that is bought with your own dignity is just slavery in disguise. It is time you stop paying their toll." Her words hit me like a physical blow. They lit a spark in the dark, hollow, invisible place inside me. The boy who hid his trophies under the bed was gone. I wasn't going to yield anymore. The boiling point, The moment that permanently shattered whatever illusion of family we had left didn't hit at the dinner table. It hit 3 days later at Terminal 4 of the international airport. My parents had planned a lavish, pre-wedding celebration trip to a luxury resort in the Bahamas for Matthew and Isabella. To save face with the extended family, they made a massive public show of inviting Grandma Rose. They bought her a new, expensive sun hat, talked loudly at Sunday dinner about how wonderful it would be to have her walking on the beach with them, and paraded their extreme generosity to anyone who would listen. We arrived at the airport at 8 a.m. to drop them off. Grandma Rose was wearing her absolute Sunday best, a beautiful pressed blouse and a navy cardigan. She was tightly clutching the handle of her small, floral suitcase. Her eyes were bright with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. She hadn't been on a vacation since my grandfather passed away. But when we got to the airline check-in counter, the agent, a tired-looking young guy named Nathan whose name tag was slightly crooked, typed furiously on his keyboard. He frowned, hit backspace a few times, and finally shook his head. "I'm sorry, folks," Nathan said, his voice carrying over the noise of the terminal. "I have the confirmed reservations here for Robert, Martha, Matthew, and Isabella, but there is absolutely no ticket under the name Rose Evans." My mother immediately let out a loud, theatrical gasp, bringing her hand to her pearls. "Oh my God! The travel agency must have made a terrible mistake. I specifically told them 5 tickets. My dad shook his head, looking aggressively at his expensive watch. "Mom, I am so incredibly sorry. This is a complete disaster. We just don't have the time to fix this with customer service before boarding. If we miss this flight, we lose the resort deposit." He turned to me, his voice totally devoid of actual regret. "Joshua, you're not flying with us anyway. Can you just take Grandma back home?" Grandma Rose just stood there, the bright excitement violently drained from her face, leaving her looking terribly small and incredibly fragile under the harsh fluorescent airport lights. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She just adjusted her grip on the handle of her suitcase, her knuckles turning stark white, and nodded slowly. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice cracking just slightly. "Have a good trip." The humiliation hanging in the air was a physical weight. It was heavier than the luggage. I stood there, paralyzed by rage, and watched my parents and brother briskly walk away toward the TSA security checkpoint. Matthew was laughing at something Isabella said. They didn't look back. Not once. I gently told Grandma to go sit on a nearby bench while I went to talk to the agent to see about getting her a refund for the lost ticket. I walked back up to the counter and leaned in close to Nathan. "Look," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "I know they're gone. I know you can't fix it, but I need to know the truth. Was there really a booking error? Did the agency mess up?" Nathan looked around nervously, sighed heavily, and leaned over the counter. He had the distinct look of a reluctant witness who absolutely hated the family drama he had just been dragged into. Man to man, Nathan said quietly, "No, there was no booking error. There was a fully paid economy ticket for her. But a guy named Matthew called our customer service line yesterday afternoon. He explicitly canceled her economy ticket. He used the refund money from her seat, plus a chunk of extra cash, to upgrade himself and his fiancée to first class. He left a strict note on the file telling the counter agents not to mention the cancellation to the older woman." My stomach plummeted straight through the floor. The terminal noise faded into a dull, ringing hum in my ears. It wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated, vicious, premeditated betrayal. Matthew had literally traded his own grandmother's seat, her joy, her inclusion in the family, for wider legroom and free champagne. And my parents had absolutely covered for him at the counter. The drive home from the airport was like driving back from a funeral. The silence in the car was deafening. Grandma didn't speak a single word. She just stared out the passenger window at the passing highway. When we finally pulled into the driveway, she got out, walked straight past her bedroom, opened the back door, and stepped out onto the patio. She knelt down in the dirt by her rose bushes and started pulling weeds with a quiet, devastating intensity. It was the physical manifestation of a broken heart. Chloe had come over to meet us. When I pulled her into the kitchen and told her exactly what Nathan at the airport had said, her expression didn't change, but her eyes went completely, terrifyingly dark. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell me it would be okay. She walked over to me, grabbed both of my hands, squeezed them hard, and said, "We don't wait for them to do it again. We end this now." That very afternoon, while Grandma rested, Chloe made a phone call to a contact she had. We drove downtown and met with a man named Elijah, a brilliant attorney who specialized strictly in elder law and asset protection. Sitting in his wood-paneled office, we laid out absolutely everything: the stolen wedding funds, the airport incident, and my growing, horrifying suspicion about the level of control my parents had over Grandma Rose's life savings. Elijah listened intently, took meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad, and didn't flinch once. When he finally looked up, he outlined our options. The power dynamic in my mind violently shifted. We set a legal trap that my family, blinded by their own arrogance, would never see coming. 5 days later, their return flight landed. My family strolled out of the international arrivals gate looking like they owned the damn building. Matthew was deeply tanned, wearing designer sunglasses indoors, laughing loudly at a joke Isabella made. My dad was pushing a heavy luggage cart with one hand, looking incredibly relaxed and pleased with himself. They were the picture of ignorant bliss. They expected to walk out, hail a premium cab, and go home to unpack their souvenirs. They absolutely did not expect to see me, Chloe, Grandma Rose, and a very intimidating man in a sharp, tailored charcoal suit, Carter, the head of the legal department at Chloe's company, standing in a line right past the sliding glass doors, waiting for them. My dad slowed his pace, the wheels of the luggage cart squeaking to a halt. His relaxed smile immediately faltered. "Joshua? Mom? What are you doing here? Did you come to pick us up?" Grandma Rose stepped forward. She wasn't leaning heavily on her cane anymore. She stood entirely straight, her shoulders squared. "I am not here to chauffeur you, Robert," she said, her voice echoing clearly over the chatter of passing travelers. "I am here to look you in the eye. You explained nothing at the ticket counter. You avoided. You minimized. You told me there was a mistake." Isabella dramatically rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her chest. "Oh my God. Are we seriously still doing this? It was a ticketing glitch, Grandma. Let it go. We bought you a magnet." "It was a first-class upgrade," I said, stepping up next to Grandma. My voice was loud. People walking by actually started to stop and look. "Matthew called the airline and canceled her ticket so you two could drink mimosas in seat 1A. And you," I pointed a finger directly at my dad's chest, "knew exactly what he did and lied to her face to protect him." Matthew immediately puffed out his chest, stepping aggressively toward me, trying to regain control of the narrative through pure intimidation. "Watch your mouth, Josh. We've supported this family for decades. I'm the one who actually brings pride to this name. You're just throwing a massive tantrum because Dad finally cut off your little wedding fund to pay for something that actually matters." That was the exact moment. The moment that tied the entire universe right back to that dinner table. Matthew sneered, turning his disgust toward Chloe. "And honestly, maybe if your fiancée actually had a real job instead of whatever cute little freelance hobby she does, you wouldn't be begging Dad for handouts like a child." Chloe didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She smiled. It was the most terrifying, predatory, satisfying smile I had ever seen on a human being. She looked Matthew dead in the eyes, reached into the pocket of her coat, and pulled out her phone. "Should I tell them what I do for a living, Matthew?" she asked, her voice echoing the exact, deadly calm tone she had used at the dinner table days prior. She turned the phone around so the screen faced my father and brother. It wasn't a photo. It was a digital copy of an official SEC corporate filing. Carter, the lawyer standing silently next to us, finally stepped forward. He reached into his briefcase and handed my dad a thick, glossy folder. "Robert Evans, Carter said, his voice pure corporate ice. My name is Carter. I am the Chief Legal Officer for Apex Tech Solutions. You've been aggressively bidding for our regional logistics contract for the past 6 months. It's the massive contract you desperately need to save your failing branch from bankruptcy, isn't it? My dad's face instantly drained of all color. He looked from Carter to Chloe, his eyes darting frantically, his brain violently short-circuiting as he tried to connect the impossible dots. I am the founder and CEO of Apex Tech, Chloe said, stepping closer to my father. I don't just have a salary, Robert. I own the board of directors you've been kissing up to. I personally signed the rejection letter for your bid this morning. Matthew's jaw literally dropped. The smugness slid off his face like wet paint. Because success doesn't excuse disrespect, Chloe continued, her voice cutting through the terminal noise like a knife. And respect doesn't require success. You judged me for wearing a cheap sweater. You treated Joshua like a ghost. And you stole your youngest son's money to pay for your oldest son's pathetic ego. The silence from my family was absolute. Matthew's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Raw, unadulterated panic set into his eyes. My mother put a trembling hand over her mouth, taking a step back. Isabella looked like she was physically going to be sick, her luxury bags dropping from her shoulders to the floor. This is a joke, my dad stammered, his voice weak. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for the first time in his life. Josh, please, tell her this is a joke. I need that contract. The only joke here is this family, I said. I felt lighter than I had in 29 years. The heavy, invisible chains I had dragged around my whole life just snapped. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The fallout from the airport confrontation was immediate, chaotic, and incredibly spectacular. By the time Chloe, Grandma, and I drove away and got back to my apartment, my phone was absolutely exploding. My dad left 4 frantic voicemails in the span of an hour. His tone violently shifted from angry demands for respect, to aggressive threats about cutting me out of the will, to finally pathetic, outright begging for me to talk to Chloe about the Apex Tech contract. I didn't answer a single one. Then came the inevitable call from Uncle Wyatt. I knew my dad had deployed him as the family fixer. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone, setting it on the coffee table while Chloe and I sat on the couch. Josh, buddy, Wyatt started, his voice dripping with that fake, overly friendly sympathy he always used when he was trying to manipulate a situation. I just heard about the crazy misunderstanding at the airport. Look, you really embarrassed your dad in public today. He's under a massive amount of pressure at work with this contract. You need to be the bigger man, call Chloe off, and smooth this over. Blood is thicker than water, son. Family is family, and you don't turn your back on them. I leaned forward, staring at the phone. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Family? I asked, my voice deadly calm. You mean like when you went through your messy divorce, and Dad completely refused to lend you a single dime to pay your lawyer to fight for custody, but Grandma secretly paid your legal retainer so you wouldn't lose your kids? Is that the unconditional family loyalty we're talking about, Wyatt? Wyatt went dead silent on the other end of the line. He didn't know I knew about that. Do not ever call me again to do my father's dirty work, I said, leaning closer to the microphone. You yield, Wyatt, because I am officially done. I tapped the screen, hung up the phone, and immediately blocked his number. I was laying down a steel boundary, and nobody in that toxic bloodline was ever crossing it again. But the absolute worst, the most sickening revelation, was yet to come. A few days later, we sat down in Elijah's law office. He had brought in Samuel, a highly skilled forensic accountant, to execute a deep dive into Grandma Rose's estate and accounts. I genuinely thought the stolen wedding fund and the malicious airline ticket cancellation were the peak of my family's cruelty. I was wrong. Samuel, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses, slid a thick stack of highlighted banking documents across the polished conference table toward us. Your parents didn't just drain your wedding fund, Joshua, Samuel explained, tapping a heavily highlighted paragraph. They've been actively committing severe financial fraud. I stared at the dizzying array of numbers on the papers. What is this? What am I looking at? 2 months ago, Samuel said, his tone gravely serious, your father had your grandmother sign a massive stack of legal documents under the guise of updating her healthcare proxies and emergency contacts. Hidden deep within that stack of papers was a binding legal authorization to take out a second mortgage on her home. The house she currently lives in. The house that is legally her sole inheritance from her late husband. All the air rushed out of my lungs. I felt dizzy. He mortgaged her house? Behind her back? Yes, Elijah nodded grimly, folding his hands on the desk, to the tune of $85,000. And the funds from that loan were routed directly to the luxury venue, the high-end caterer, and the boutique florist for Matthew's wedding. If your grandmother passes away, or if they default on the payments they can't afford, the bank takes the house. She is effectively completely broke, Joshua. I slowly turned my head to look at Grandma Rose. She was sitting in the leather chair beside me, staring out the large window of the office at the city skyline. Her hands were neatly folded in her lap. She didn't look shocked. She didn't cry. She just looked incredibly, profoundly tired of being used. We are going to legally destroy them, Chloe whispered next to me, her hand gripping mine so hard my knuckles popped. And she was absolutely right. We had the irrefutable paper evidence. We had the lawyers. And for the very first time in my entire life, we had the power. My parents had built a towering house of cards strictly on the broken backs of the people they viewed as weak and disposable. Now it was time to light the match and burn it all to the ground. 6 weeks later, the day of absolute reckoning finally arrived. We did not go to a dramatic, wood-paneled courtroom with a judge banging a heavy wooden gavel. We went to a highly sterile, fiercely private, an incredibly intimidating conference room located on the 42nd floor of a towering downtown corporate legal building. It was a mandatory mediation hearing. This was the absolute final step, the last possible off-ramp before we unleashed a massive, incredibly public civil lawsuit that would have permanently destroyed my father's corporate career and whatever was left of my brother's social reputation. The conference room smelled faintly of expensive lemon furniture polish and stale, bitter black coffee. The massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooked the entire sprawling city, but the atmosphere inside that room was suffocatingly tense. The air felt heavy, like the moments right before a massive thunderstorm breaks. I sat on one side of a long, incredibly heavy oak table. Chloe sat directly to my right. Her posture was impeccably straight, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She radiated a quiet, terrifying, and absolute authority. Grandma Rose sat to my left, wearing her absolute best navy blue dress and a simple pearl necklace. She looked incredibly calm. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Flanking us were Elijah, our brilliant elder law attorney, and Samuel, the forensic accountant who had uncovered the massive depths of my family's financial depravity. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy wooden door clicked open, and my family walked in. I almost didn't recognize my father. Robert Evans, the man who used to stride into every single room like he owned the entire building, looked visibly aged. He looked like he had aged 10 years in just 6 weeks. His shoulders were heavily slumped forward. His usually pristine, custom-tailored suit looked slightly wrinkled, and the arrogant, entitled spark in his eyes had been completely extinguished. Without the highly lucrative Apex tech contract that Chloe had personally canceled, his regional corporate branch was actively hemorrhaging money, and I knew his personal salary had been severely slashed by his panicked board of directors. He was a man watching his entire fabricated, superficial kingdom completely crumble to dust around him. My mother, Martha, walked in right behind him. She was nervously clutching her expensive designer handbag against her chest like a physical shield. She kept her eyes glued to the expensive carpet. She absolutely wouldn't make eye contact with me, with Chloe, or with Grandma Rose. Then came Matthew. He didn't look like the flawless golden child anymore. He looked exhausted, deeply defensive, and incredibly cornered. The massive stress of his rapidly collapsing luxury wedding plans was written all over his pale face. He had dark, heavy bags under his eyes. They sat down on the completely opposite side of the table. The physical distance between us was only a few feet of polished wood, but it felt like a massive, unbridgeable canyon. We were no longer a family. We were opposing parties in a legal battlefield. Julian, the court-appointed legal mediator, sat at the head of the table. He was a man in his late 50s with calm, highly observant eyes and a strictly professional demeanor that clearly communicated he had zero tolerance for emotional nonsense or family theatrics. He opened a thick manila folder, carefully adjusted his reading glasses, and looked directly at my father. "Robert," Julian began, his voice incredibly smooth but carrying the weight of a sledgehammer. "We are here today to officially discuss the unauthorized liquidation of protected funds, the gross mishandling of fiduciary duties, and the fraudulent securing of a second mortgage on the residential property owned solely by your mother, Rose Evans. We have the complete forensic accounting reports right here on the table. Let me be perfectly, absolutely clear with you before we begin. If we do not reach a binding, structured financial settlement today in this room, the opposing counsel is fully prepared to take this directly to civil court. Furthermore, given the severity of the forged signatures, they are prepared to involve the district attorney for felony elder financial abuse." My father swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet room. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously above his expensive silk tie. "Julian, please listen to me," my father pleaded, his voice cracking slightly. "This is a massive, terrible family misunderstanding. We were simply managing her estate to protect her assets. I am her son. I have always had her absolute best interests in mind. The mortgage on her house was just a temporary bridge loan. It was a cash flow solution. I was fully going to pay it back entirely after I got my end-of-year corporate promotion and the subsequent bonus." Elijah, our lawyer, didn't even raise his voice. He didn't need to yell. He simply reached into his file, pulled out a single piece of paper, and slid it smoothly across the polished wood table until it stopped right in front of my father. It was a highlighted copy of the loan origination document. "You did not secure a bridge loan, Robert," Elijah stated with cold, terrifying precision. "You intentionally buried a massive mortgage authorization inside a thick stack of routine medical proxy paperwork. You deliberately and maliciously obscured the true nature of those legal documents from a 78-year-old woman who trusted you completely. Furthermore, the routing numbers on the bank transfers clearly show that every single dollar from that fraudulent loan was wired directly to a luxury catering company, a boutique florist, and an exclusive high-end country club to illegally fund Matthew's wedding." Matthew violently slammed his hand down on the table, causing the water glasses to shake. His face flushed a bright, angry red. "I didn't know where the actual money was coming from. Dad said he was taking care of it. He told me he had a special college fund he had finally cashed out for me, or some old tech investments that matured. You absolutely cannot put this on me. I am the victim here too." I leaned forward, placing my forearms on the table, locking eyes directly with my older brother. I didn't feel intimidated by him anymore. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Matthew," I said, my voice steady and completely unwavering. "You knew Dad didn't have $85,000 just sitting around in a checking account. You knew his branch was failing. You just didn't care whose blood you had to completely drain to get your perfect, incredibly selfish day. You threw your own grandmother out of her airplane seat at the terminal so you could drink free champagne in first class. And you were perfectly, happily willing to let her lose her only home so you could eat prime rib with Isabella's wealthy friends." "Joshua, please stop," my mother whispered, her voice trembling as tears finally spilled over her cheeks. "Please don't talk to your brother like that. We are still a family. We can fix this. We can sit down and talk." "No, Martha," Grandma Rose spoke up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a profound weight of authority that completely silenced the entire room. We are not a family. We are a biology experiment that went terribly, horribly wrong. Family protects each other when they are vulnerable. You used me. You looked at the beautiful house my late husband built with his own 2 hands, the house where we held his funeral, the house where I raised you, Robert, and you saw absolutely nothing but a disposable ATM machine. Julian raised a hand, stopping the argument before my mother could start sobbing loudly. The facts presented here are entirely indisputable, Julian said, closing the folder. The forensic trail is absolute. Robert, Matthew, you have exactly 2 choices right now. You signed the binding settlement agreement today. This agreement legally mandates a structured, aggressive monthly repayment plan with high interest until the entire $85,000 from the mortgage, plus the entire wedding fund stolen from Joshua, are fully returned to Rose Evans' control. If you miss a single payment by even 24 hours, a legal lien will be immediately placed on your own personal home, Martha and Robert, and the criminal suit will be instantly filed. My dad looked down at his trembling hands. The reality of his absolute defeat finally crushed him. He had absolutely no leverage. He had no clever angles left to play. His lucrative corporate promotion was completely gone. His golden child was turning violently against him, and his darkest secret was fully exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the legal system. With a shaking, defeated hand, Robert picked up the heavy black pen. He didn't say a single word. He didn't offer a single apology. He simply signed his name on the dotted line, legally binding himself to years of crushing, suffocating financial debt to repay exactly what he had stolen. Matthew signed right next to him as a legally bound co-guarantor. When we walked out of that massive glass building and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sun, I took a massive, deep breath. The downtown city air tasted incredibly sweet. We hadn't just won the stolen money back. We had permanently shattered the toxic illusion they had trapped me in my entire life. The immediate, devastating consequences of that mediation hearing struck my family like a runaway freight train. Karma didn't just knock on their door. It kicked the door entirely off the hinges. Without my stolen wedding fund, and completely without the stolen equity from Grandma's mortgaged house, the massive Royal Magazine wedding Matthew and Isabella had so arrogantly planned violently and publicly collapsed. The exclusive luxury country club they had booked demanded their final, massive payment exactly 30 days before the event. When my dad's overextended credit cards aggressively bounced, the club manager immediately canceled their reservation, permanently released the date, and legally kept the massive initial deposit. The boutique florist, realizing they absolutely weren't getting paid the remaining $20,000 balance for their rare imported orchids, pulled out entirely. Isabella's reaction was exactly as explosive and materialistic as you would expect. When Matthew finally had to sit her down and confess that the money was entirely gone, that his family was essentially completely broke, drowning in legal debt, and facing potential criminal fraud charges if they missed a payment, she threw an absolute earth-shattering fit. She didn't try to comfort him. She didn't suggest they go to the courthouse and get married anyway because she loved him. She screamed at him in my parents' driveway, loud enough for the entire suburban neighborhood to hear clearly through their living room windows. She called him a pathetic liar, a fraud, and a failure. She violently threw her expensive diamond engagement ring directly into my mother's rose bushes, called off the entire wedding, and drove away in her luxury SUV, leaving tire marks on the asphalt. Matthew spent 3 entire days frantically digging through my parents' thorny landscaping, his hands bleeding, trying desperately to find the diamond ring so he could pawn it to pay off his mounting credit card debt. He ended up having to permanently move back into his old childhood bedroom because he could no longer afford his downtown luxury apartment lease without my dad subsidizing his lifestyle. The golden child, the man who could do absolutely no wrong, was finally forced to live in the harsh, unforgiving reality he had always been shielded from. In sharp, incredibly beautiful contrast, Chloe and I refused to let their miserable, self-inflicted destruction dictate our joy. 2 months after the mediation, we officially got married. We didn't book a massive, overpriced hall. We didn't invite 300 superficial people we barely knew to impress our neighbors. We hosted an incredibly intimate, incredibly warm ceremony in a small, historic botanical greenhouse on the edge of the city. The afternoon light filtered perfectly through the glass ceiling, illuminating the massive ferns and blooming tropical flowers. I wore a simple, tailored suit I bought off the rack, and Chloe wore a stunning, understated vintage lace dress that took my breath away the moment she walked down the small dirt aisle. We invited exactly 30 of our closest, truest friends. Elijah, our lawyer, and Samuel, the accountant, were there celebrating with us. Carter was there, but the absolute most important guest sat right in the very front row. Grandma Rose. She wore a beautiful, vibrant, pale pink dress, and she cried quiet tears of pure, unadulterated joy when we exchanged our vows. There was absolutely no tension in the room. There was no Uncle Wyatt loudly complaining about the temperature of the food or trying to give me unsolicited, toxic advice about his own bitter custody battles and divorce. There was no father sitting in the corner, arrogantly judging the cost of the wine or comparing the venue to his country club. It was just pure, incredibly safe love. A week after our beautiful wedding, Grandma Rose asked Chloe and me to drive her downtown to Elijah's law office one last time. She sat down at that same heavy oak conference table, opened a fresh manila folder, and completely rewrote her entire last will and testament. Her original will had blindly left the house and all her remaining financial assets entirely to my father, assuming he would do the right thing. With a few swift, decisive strokes of her pen, she legally and permanently revoked that document. She structured her new will to leave her entire inheritance to a local, highly rated charity that provides emergency housing assistance and legal aid for displaced seniors. She also set aside a small, fiercely protected trust specifically for the future college fund of any children Chloe and I might have. She explicitly, by name, wrote Robert, Martha, and Matthew completely out of the will. She didn't do it out of malice, revenge, or spite. She did it to fiercely protect her own peace of mind. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that if she left them even a single dime of inheritance, they would spend the rest of her life circling her like desperate vultures, waiting for her funeral so they could fight over the scraps. By legally severing their financial ties and removing the incentive of an inheritance, she finally cut the toxic puppet strings they had tried to aggressively attach to her back. As we walked out of Elijah's office that afternoon, Grandma Rose stopped on the sidewalk, looked up at the clear blue sky, and smiled a genuine, beautiful smile. The heavy, invisible burden of fear and manipulation she had carried in my parents' house was permanently, finally gone. The absolute final step in completely severing our ties with the dark past was getting Grandma Rose physically out of that toxic, suffocating house. The structured settlement payments from my father began arriving exactly on the first of every single month, strictly monitored by the court to ensure he couldn't hide a single penny. With her finances finally secure and safely returning to her absolute control, Chloe and I spent weeks helping her find a brand new place to live. We found a beautiful, small, single-story cottage located just 3 blocks away from the apartment Chloe and I shared. It had a bright, welcoming yellow front door, massive bay windows that let in incredible amounts of natural afternoon sunlight, and most importantly, a spacious, fully fenced-in backyard with incredibly rich, dark soil. It was the absolute perfect blank canvas for a master gardener who desperately needed to rebuild her life. Moving day was the absolute last time I ever stepped foot inside my parents' house. Chloe and I hired a highly professional moving crew to carefully pack up Grandma's downstairs suite. My parents locked themselves in the upstairs master bedroom the entire time we were there. They didn't come down to say a final goodbye. They didn't offer to help carry a single lightweight box. They hid like absolute cowards, entirely unable to face the harsh reality of what their blinding greed had permanently cost them. Matthew was sitting alone on the living room couch in his pajamas at 2 in the afternoon, staring blankly at the muted television screen. He looked up when I carried a heavy cardboard box full of Grandma's old, cherished photo albums past him toward the front door. "You really tore this entire family apart, Josh," Matthew muttered, his voice dripping with bitter, misplaced resentment, and completely lacking any self-awareness. I stopped walking. I stood there, holding the heavy box. I didn't feel angry anymore. The raging fire inside me had burned out, leaving nothing but cold clarity. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity for him. He was a grown man who still entirely believed the universe owed him absolutely everything simply for existing. "I didn't tear anything apart, Matt," I said calmly, looking down at him. "I just turned the lights on in the room. You guys were the ones who built the entire house on rotten wood. Enjoy the view." I walked out the front door, loaded the box into the back of the moving truck, and never looked back at that house again. The physical and emotional transformation in Grandma Rose over the next few months was nothing short of completely miraculous. Without the constant, suffocating, daily stress of walking on eggshells around my parents, her physical health noticeably improved. The chronic, painful inflammation in her joints seemed to magically lessen. She stopped leaning so heavily on her wooden cane when she walked around the neighborhood. The deep, exhausted lines around her eyes softened into smile lines. She spent absolutely every waking hour completely transforming the empty backyard of her new cottage. She bought bags of fresh soil, specialized fertilizers, and new gardening tools. She planted vibrant, perfectly straight rows of red and white climbing roses, massive, blooming bushes of bright blue hydrangeas, and a dedicated, fragrant section just for fresh cooking herbs like basil, rosemary, and thyme. She set up a small wooden bird feeder that attracted bright red cardinals, and she placed a comfortable, heavy iron bench directly under the cool shade of a large, ancient oak tree in the corner of the yard. I would go over to her house every single Sunday morning. We would sit together on that iron bench, drinking hot green tea, completely surrounded by the blooming, vibrant life she had cultivated with her own 2 hands. She looked easily 10 years younger. She was no longer the quiet, frightened, marginalized woman hiding in the downstairs suite, desperately hoping to avoid her son's arrogant wrath. She was a woman who owned her own space, owned her own time, and completely owned her own profound worth. "You know, Joshua," she said to me one Sunday, gently brushing a stray, dried leaf off her knee and looking out over her blooming roses, "I used to genuinely think that enduring bad treatment was a noble sign of family loyalty. I thought if I just loved them hard enough, if I just gave them enough chances, eventually they would learn how to love me back. But you absolutely cannot plant a beautiful, delicate seed in toxic, heavily poisoned soil and expect it to miraculously grow. You have to have the incredible courage to pull up the roots and plant yourself somewhere new, where the sun actually shines." I looked around her incredibly vibrant, thriving garden, taking in the sweet smell of the flowers, and I knew exactly what she meant. We had both pulled up our roots from that toxic family tree, and for the very first time in our entire lives, we were finally blooming. As for me, the entire brutal ordeal fundamentally and permanently shifted the entire trajectory of my life. The passive, quiet, deeply invisible second son, who hid his achievements under the bed, completely ceased to exist. I continued my professional work as a freelance architectural designer, but my primary focus drastically shifted. I reached out to Elijah, the brilliant attorney who had helped us save Grandma, and offered my design services. I started working closely alongside his legal firm, specifically designing and consulting on accessible, highly affordable housing modifications for elderly clients. These were people who desperately wanted to safely age in place in their own homes, rather than being forced into predatory, expensive nursing homes by greedy relatives who were just trying to liquidate their assets. Felt like a profound, incredible calling. It felt like absolute, undeniable purpose. Every single time I helped an older client legally secure their home, redesign their living space for optimal safety, and fiercely protect their independence from those who wished to exploit them, I felt like I was healing a small, deeply wounded piece of my own inner child. I was finally using my voice, my skills, and my career to build walls that actually protected vulnerable people, instead of walls that trapped them in the dark shadows. Chloe's tech company continued to massively thrive. She never once rubbed her incredible corporate success in my family's face after that explosive day at the airport. She simply didn't need to. Her immense power didn't come from a desperate need to dominate or belittle others. It came from a deep, unshakable, quiet security in exactly who she was. She is, without a doubt, the strongest, most compassionate person I know, and building a peaceful, beautiful life with her is the absolute greatest privilege I have ever been granted. I still occasionally hear rumors about my family through the neighborhood grapevine. I heard my dad eventually lost his corporate position entirely due to poor performance and had to take a massive, embarrassing demotion at a much smaller, struggling firm, drastically reducing his salary. I heard Matthew is still miserably living in his childhood bedroom, aggressively bouncing between entry-level marketing jobs, still blindly blaming everyone in the world for his total lack of a promotion. But honestly, I don't actively seek out the information. They are complete strangers to me now. They are just strangers who happen to share my last name. If there is one thing this entire brutal, incredibly painful, yet ultimately beautiful journey has taught me, it is this. Real, authentic family is absolutely not defined by the biology or the blood in your veins. It is not defined by a shared last name, or a shared childhood address, or a toxic obligation to show up to tense holiday dinners just to keep the peace. Real family is defined entirely by who actually shows up for you when the chips are down. It is defined by the people who celebrate your quiet victories instead of burying them under the bed. It is defined by the people who completely refuse to let you shrink yourself so they can feel incredibly tall. Grandma Rose finally regained her voice. I finally found my own voice standing firmly right beside her. And the ugly, uncomfortable truth we dragged kicking and screaming out into the open light didn't destroy our lives. It completely rebuilt them on a solid, unbreakable foundation of absolute honesty. As we wrap up this story, I want to take a moment to talk directly to you about the deeper, fundamental lesson here. I know, without a doubt, that there are people watching this video right now who are silently enduring the exact same toxic, suffocating dynamic in their own homes. Financial abuse of the elderly and deep emotional manipulation within families thrives exclusively in complete silence. It thrives when we are aggressively conditioned from childhood to believe that keeping the peace is somehow more important than protecting our own basic human dignity. When my dad stole my hard-earned wedding fund and secretly, maliciously mortgaged my grandmother's house, he relied entirely on the arrogant assumption that our deep loyalty to the perfect family image would keep us completely quiet and compliant. The most powerful, educational takeaway from this entire nightmare is that setting a steel boundary is never an act of betrayal. It is an absolute, necessary act of profound self-preservation. You do absolutely not owe your financial future, your precious mental health, or your absolute sanity to people who only view you as a disposable resource to be exploited. It takes incredible, terrifying courage to stop yielding. It takes immense bravery to seek professional legal counsel, to look directly at your own parents or siblings and say, no more. But the absolute peace, the freedom, and the lightness that waits for you on the other side of that boundary is worth every single uncomfortable, difficult conversation. You always have the absolute right to pull up your roots from toxic soil. I want to hear from you now. What is the most important lesson you are taking away from this story? Share your perspective and your own experiences in the comments below. Or, if you simply agree that setting hard, uncompromising boundaries with toxic family members is completely necessary for your own peace and survival, just comment the word good down below. It lets me know that this story resonated with you, and that the hard lessons we learned can help someone else find their voice. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.